Namaskar, welcome back. Ever since the results of the German elections earlier this week, commentators all over the world, including India, have been writing constantly about how Europe seems to be taking a right turn. Of course, some of the commentators have termed this as a dangerous signal, while others have said that this was waiting to happen considering the political and the socio-economic scenario of Europe. So, is this a dangerous signal for Europe? What does it mean for the rest of the world? Is the rise of the right in Europe just an aberration, or does it have a deeper message? We will discuss all that, but before that, a quick look at what's really going on.
Europe is turning to the right. The latest reflection of this trend was visible in the German elections this week. Alternative for Democracy, or the AfD, emerged as a surprise second with 21% of votes. AfD may be in opposition on the Bundestag, but its rise has triggered a huge debate. Significantly, the biggest support for AfD has come from the young voters. Previously, the elections to the European Parliament and national elections in Poland, Austria, Belgium and France witnessed a significant right-wing shift. Experts have placed these right-wing parties in three categories: those which tried but failed to garner much support, those which are on the ascendant and have become principal opposition parties, and then those which are in power. In terms of personalities, Italy's Giorgia Meloni and Hungary's Viktor Orban have emerged as the strongest faces of the far right.
We have a special panel of guests here with me who will help us understand the questions that I have just placed before you. Joining me straight from London, Pandit Satish Sharma. You have heard him on Media Scan earlier, an erudite scholar, an author, and calls himself and has been writing on issues related to Sanatan Dharma, Hinduism and current politics. Namaskar, Pandit Sharma. Welcome, sir.
Har Har Mahadev ji.
Har Har Mahadev. And also with us, Abhinav Pandya, geopolitical expert, well-known author. Welcome, Abhinav.
Namaskar, Har Har Mahadev.
If I may start with Pandit Satish Sharma, sir, as you can see very clearly, there is a definite right turn visible in European politics. As I said, do you think those commentators who consider this an aberration are closer to the truth, or does it have a deeper, more substantive message?
It's a wonderful place to start the conversation. As somebody who's lived in Europe and worked across Europe for the last, I've lived here for over 55 years, worked across Europe for the last 35 years. And so I have extensive connections and an experience in what's happening here. I think the commentators who are saying that something deeper is happening are actually closer to the mark. The right-left paradigm, many people are beginning to feel, is an artificial construct, that it's something that was created to convince the population that they actually had choices, and that by participating in what they thought was a democratic republic, they would be exercising their democratic rights and were going to be governed in the old manner of from the people, by the people, of the people. That sort of democratic government was something that they had assumed. But the last decade has shown them that, in fact, their interests have seemingly plummeted to the bottom of the list. And so populations across Europe are now saying, hold on a minute, our elected representatives, those who are supposedly representing our interests, seem to have forgotten who it is that they are working for. And so all of the institutions of the state, the civil service, the public sector, all supposedly created and funded by the general public for their own interests, are now being scrutinized. And in fact, in most of the Western European countries, the population is beginning to feel, actually, we're putting money in for our taxes and we're getting nothing out. Not only are we getting nothing out, what we are witnessing is the erosion of our human rights. And so now that has created a
Pandit Sharma,
conflict.
just a query here. For sake of clarity, you are saying all this left politics, right politics, far right politics, this is all perhaps an academic or maybe even an artificial construct. What the people want is their daily bread and butter issues. Whoever satisfies that has to be chosen.
Absolutely right. In fact, if you look at the United Kingdom, we are seeing more criminality and more violence from those people who traditionally would have been labelled far left or even the left. And what we're seeing from the far right seems to be, certainly in the United Kingdom, hardly any physical presence on the streets at all. And so it's almost as though these two extremes, as you go from the center outwards to the left and to the right, it's almost as though you're on a circle and they come back and join at the far end and they're both as extreme as each other. I think the desire for governments to create this polarity, though, is something that the population is also now beginning to question. They're beginning to say, hang on a minute, we don't see the rise of the far right in the manner in which it's being painted to us. Here in the United Kingdom, we have had some very unfortunate tragedies on an incredible scale, and the government has leapt in to protect the left and the far left and create the bogeyman of a far right, and the public are not buying it. So the whole sham of, I call these sham democracies. The whole concept of a sham democracy is now being questioned by the public themselves.
Okay, that's an interesting point to carry on the conversation. Abhinav, coming to you, Pandit Sharma just mentioned that all this thing about the far right is perhaps more of creating of a bogey rather than what is on the ground. But nevertheless, people are writing that there used to be a right-wing politics very much visible all over Europe earlier too. The cause of concern is that it is the far right which is becoming more vocal and visible, and particularly in the case of Germany as well. Now my question to you is, do you think Germany is following what a major part of Europe is also doing, and whether this rise of the right is expected to sustain? Because they are not in power in most of the countries, they are either in coalition or they are perhaps the principal opposition.
Thank you, Smitaji. Let me begin with this very captive expression for Europe's current situation. Is that too little, too late? Well, Europe doesn't have the luxury to indulge in the philosophical and ideological movements of left and right. The point from where I see Europe, I feel that Europe has already entered into a phase where it is facing a battle for survival, an existential and identity question, basic, for a kind of a race against time, race against survival. Internally, it's facing severe crisis in the form of, your wokeism culture, Islamist invasion, which seems to be an all-encompassing massive invasion for Europe. Externally, the transatlantic security structure is in shambles, particularly after the arrival of Trump. Europe is totally insecure and they don't know who is going to invade them. They don't have the capability. They don't have the strength to fight. Technologically, they don't have those capabilities right now. It is no more a leader in technology. Economically, it has extreme dependence on China for all the supply chains and all those things. So I think Europe has this very shocking realization of intense insecurities. And at this stage, Europe doesn't know where to go, what to do. So I think
So what is the point? Abhinav, what is the point?
Or what people say far right in the European elections.
Why are people opting for right-wing parties in this scenario? I mean, this is like a churning.
It is just an expression of people's extreme fears and insecurities. They feel that they need some kind of saviors, and they are totally frustrated and fed up with these European complicated, complex, politically correct bureaucracies who have tedious, long processes and very idealistic notions of addressing core security issues like refugees and all. On the other hand, these far-right voices are quite vocal and very, correct and very, I would say, frank about this Islamist invasion and the other kinds of crisis situation that Europe has already entered into or it is going to face in the future. So they appear like saviors to the common people. But I think that, the game has already been lost, and fine, they can win elections and all, but there's not much that they can do. And
Okay.
India also needs to be very cautious while engaging it with Europe right now.
Okay, I'll come back to the India question in just a few minutes. But before that, Pandit Sharma, the cultural onslaught on Europe and all the insecurities that are playing on the minds of the people, it seems the right and the far right have been able to give voice to it in a better manner than the left perhaps, and that is why they are winning or becoming important in the political scene, number one. And the second quick question, sir, if such is the trend in the rest of Europe, why did your country of residence at present, the UK, buck the trend and go with such a heavy majority with the Labour?
It's an extraordinary question. There are so many intersections here. Just picking up on one of Abhinavji's points, which relates to your question, I think it's probably clearer to understand that what we're seeing is the vocalization of indigeneity. The indigenous people of the United Kingdom, of Germany and other places are now being very vocal about the fact they're saying we have a right to live in our homelands, our ancestral homelands, where the society and the culture, the way in which we rule and govern ourselves, we have had a hand in it. Not only that, our ancestors, immediate and also distant, have sacrificed blood, toil, effort and sweat in building the societies of which we are a part. So they are very clearly articulating indigeneity, which is quite interesting because Europe, the European nations, Fortress Europe as I call it, are actually the ones who denied the concept of indigeneity to the global south and the vast majority of the non-white, non-Christian world. So there is an element of Gadma being experienced here. The indigenous voice is turning against the globalist voice, and the globalist voice has always actually followed the psyche and the mindset of the left and the extreme left, the liberal elite as it's painted. I'm reminded of something that Sitaram Goyalji and Ram Surupji were having a conversation, and in that conversation it was noted that if you're not left-wing in your 20s, you have no heart. And if you're still left-wing in your 30s, you have no brain. And so I think what we're seeing is a maturation, a journey from having all of those ideals which somebody else has to pay for and which are by and large untested and are unproven in experience and history. And then when the chickens come home to roost, the problems descend. One other aspect which I think is really...
Sir, are you saying
Ji.
that Europe is moving further from the heart and becoming closer to reflection of the brains?
I think it's moving further from shallow emotional virtue signaling, which certainly makes most people who have a savior mentality feel very empowered, and it gives them a glow, doesn't it? But those of us who study history will also recall that there's a famous adage, the pathway to hell is paved with good intentions. And I think the people who are in power have been enjoying experimenting with their good intentions and their net zero and all these sorts of projects without realizing that in fact an economy is sustained on the effort and the toil of the citizens. It's
Right.
the citizens who create wealth, not governments. And this is something that's really being driven home to the politicians now.
Abhinav, in the midst of all this debate, this whole churning going on in Europe, what is interesting is the fact that if we just look at Germany, which triggered this whole conversation, the votes of the young people, say between 18 to 31, 32 years of age, has gone in the biggest numbers to the far right, the AfD party, which is now going to be the strongest opposition because nobody wants to, form a coalition government with them. So, what do you attribute this reaction of the young minds? Is it because the wokeism has gone beyond a point where society is not ready to accept it? And why this kind of reluctance in the minds of the elderly to change their voting pattern faster than the youth?
Well, I mean, this kind of a vote shift and also these internal splits, they suggest an internal rupturing, I must say. So, yes, wokeism is definitely a big social concern and also a point of controversy, debate and crisis in in European societies these days. It's being a matter of debate in the universities, think tanks, society, social spaces, family, everywhere. But as regards the young generations, shift towards the AfD and these far right political parties, I think this massive, Islamic invasion from the refugees and their activities in the recent past, like certain stabbings, killings, occupation of the social spaces, private spaces, public spaces, that is creating a major sense of alarm, and it's a big challenge to the European values of free expression, liberalism. So I think the young generation has come face to face with these challenges, but the older generation is still quite ensconced in that post-Second World War world order in which Europe has its prime time, and Europe had its peak days in terms of economic prosperity, social stability, and well-functioning democracies. But the younger generation are facing a major crisis in terms of value systems, wokeism, also economic crisis, jobs, and all those things, and also the crisis related to security. So their thought patterns are quite different, and their reactions are quite different.
It seems that yes,
they're quite disillusioned with the democratic systems and these very complex bureaucracies of Europe.
So it is also human nature and very common that the insecurities of the young people, they get reflected quicker than those of the elderly. So that point is well taken. But before we move on to a couple of other questions, a quick listen in to what the Italian Premier Giorgia Meloni had to say about the rise of the right-wing politics and the hypocrisy of the left wing in one of her very bold statements recently.
Today, when Trump, Meloni, Milei, or maybe Modi talk, they are called a threat to democracy. This is the left's double standard. But we're used to it. We are used to it. And the good news is people no longer believe in their lies. Despite all the mud they throw at us, citizens keep voting for us. Because simply, people are not naive as the left considers them. They vote for us because we defend freedom. We love our nations. We want secure borders. We preserve businesses and citizens from the green leftist insanity. We defend family and life. We fight against wokeism. We protect our sacred right to our faith and our free speech.
So, Pandit Sharma, in recent days, perhaps the most emphatic expression of why the right is rising. But as you saw, Ms. Meloni has also mentioned Mr. Trump, Mr. Modi as well, trying to say that this is not limited to Europe only, it's across the Atlantic, it's all over the globe. Do you think right-wing politics is becoming more assertive and more reflective of the people's aspirations worldwide?
Well, let's just pick up on what she said there. Remember, she referred to democracy, and Prime Minister Modi and indeed President Trump have been returned into power with huge democratic mandates. And so it's a nonsense to declare them as being anything other than the will of the people as expressed in a democracy. Now, it's a funny thing about the left. Sometimes the left are so far to the left that anything to the right of them they see as being far right. And I think we're beginning to see that. Another interesting thought just occurred to me. It used to be said that you can vote the left in, but you have to fight to get the left out. Because more often than not, they will use democratic means to secure power and then completely resort to non-democratic means to maintain power. And in the United Kingdom and across Europe, we're beginning to see the left exert non-democratic means to retain its power. We're seeing constraints on freedom of expression. We're seeing constraints on the manner in which people vote. And we are seeing the imposition of, shall we say, identity-related legislation which is contrary to the non-sectarian views of the populations. Here in the United Kingdom, the Labour Party has just announced the day before yesterday the formation of a council to discuss Islamophobia. Now, that is a sectarian statement. All human rights should be equally applicable, irrespective of your identity, irrespective of race, religion, and creed. This is why we put money into the exchequers. We put, the money that goes in is actually completely non-sectarian and non-identitarian, and it should be spent in that manner. So we are literally seeing a very dramatic shift from democratic processes to non-democratic processes, more so than from the left to the extreme right. But there's one other thing with regard to Bharat, which I think we should really also note.
Yes,
Europe
quickly,
has no natural resources. Fortress Europe was created by colonizers stealing the wealth of other nations and bringing it back home to Europe. And what we are now seeing is the end of the colonial dividend. We are seeing France being thrown out of Africa on a daily basis in many places. We're seeing Ghana and Switzerland say, well, actually, Ghana is saying, we're not going to send you cocoa so that you can make chocolate and then charge us lots of money for buying the same product. So as the world decolonizes as well, Europe is going to be under a great deal of pressure. And I would suggest that the Bharatiya government approach Europe very, very carefully.
Okay. Just taking a cue from that, I have very little time left, so a very quick take from Abhinav Pandya on what you have just mentioned. All of this week, there were lots of very interesting deliberations between Government of India and the EU. Ms. von der Leyen, who has been touring India, has been very profound in praising India's potential as a world power, etc. Abhinav Pandya, how do you look at Pandit Sharma's comment that India needs to approach Europe and the EU cautiously, and why do you think EU is now looking at India with such hope?
Thank you. In fact, I absolutely agree with Panditji's comment. In fact, in my initial opening remarks, I mentioned that India needs to be very cautiously optimistic while engaging with the Europe. In the recent times, I must say that there are certain think tanks and there are certain lobbies of experts in India very closely associated with the Western deep state and the George Soros lobby. They are trying to project Europe in the Indian geopolitical space in a major way, and also trying to get the government and the Ministry of External Affairs and also the senior political leadership, the ideological leadership, BJP, RSS, more and more involved in engaging with Europe. But here we must understand that world order is in transition, and in all what's happening around us, Europe has come out as the biggest loser. In this entire Russia-Ukraine gambit, we saw that Russia is again a major player. Americans are making a major change. Chinese are on their own trajectory. This is the moment when India is in its sweetest spot, and India has a lot at stake right now to make good of this opportunity. India should not while away or waste this opportunity by playing wrong cards or betting on the wrong players. Certainly, Europe is in the crisis right now. Europe is looking at India perhaps as a new supply chain center, or let's say in investment destination which can bring some benefits to Europe in terms of investments and FTAs and all. But then we have to be careful. What do we gain out of that? I mean, this is the same Europe which they never used to stop criticizing India on the human rights issues and Kashmir issues. Now today they are in the same boat. They are facing that radical Islamist invasion. So I think India's approach has to be very transactional, and it has to be based in realpolitik while dealing with Europe. No more fantasies, no more emotional and ideological entanglements.
Fine. I'm afraid that's all the time we have. I wish we could have carried on this conversation a little longer. But thank you very much, both of you, Pandit Satish Sharma from London and Abhinav Pandya, for finding the time on the weekend. It was a great, enlightening conversation. See you again.
Look forward to it. Our pleasure.
Europe is in a churning. The rise of the right seems to be a fallout of that churning, socio-economic and political. Now it remains to be seen whether this trend will sustain or will it prove to be an aberration, as pointed out by some critics. Thank you for joining Media Scan on this weekend. See you next weekend with another issue of global importance. Till then, namaskar.